What are some downright disturbing facts you know? Story 1. Ever thought about how whales and dolphins die? When they get too old and too weak to swim up to the surface to breathe, they start to slowly sink towards the deep, cold depths of the ocean and suffocate in the dark. The size thresholds for animals that die like this are studied in detail by engineers because their corpses will exist at such a high pressure that the carbon compounds they decompose into will be heavier than water. This means that all the carbon they consume in their lives will be extracted from the atmosphere and stored in the ocean in a carbon pool. Encouraging the growth of the populations over this threshold is thought to be a key to reducing the ppm CO2 in the atmosphere. Story 2. Lobotomies were a complete guessing game, and the procedure's success was mostly based on whether or not the patient was deemed calm and quiet post-surgery. Walter Freeman, the man who popularized lobotomies in America, wasn't even a surgeon. He had to partner with an actual surgeon to attempt the procedure, but Freeman didn't care about the length of the surgery, so he invented the ice pick lobotomy. Use an ice pick to access the brain by hammering the pick through the bone above the eye and near the nose, and then just wiggling it around. As stated before, Freeman was not a surgeon, so when the actual surgeon he partnered with walked into their shared office to find Freeman with an ice pick halfway in a patient's brain, their partnership ended immediately. But that didn't stop Freeman from continuing his work with lobotomies. He toured the nation in a van he called the Lobotomobile, offering the procedure to insane asylums with problem patients. Freeman completed over 3,000 lobotomies throughout his career, of which nearly 500 patients died, and 1,000 were left in a vegetative state. Story 3. In the 90s, a British Airways pilot was sucked out of the cockpit at 23,000 feet due to a poorly installed window seal failure, and he got pinned against the airplane as the flight attendants tried to keep him from completely getting sucked away, but he survived, suffering only a few bone fractures and frostbite. Story 4. I could be butchering some of these details since it's been a while since I learned about it, but there is this amoeba that's super rare and found in fresh water, and people who go swimming have an extremely unlikely chance of contracting, but if they do, it will pretty much obliterate your brain and kill you, and there's pretty much nothing you can do about it. Story 5. In the early hours of September 26, 1983, a false alarm at a Soviet bunker indicated the launch of multiple American nuclear missiles. Everyone in the bunker except for one man, Stanislav Petrov, thought it was a real attack, but Petrov correctly assumed that if the USA was to launch an attack, it would have been hundreds of bombs, leading him to not tell higher-ups, who likely would have ordered a counterattack leading to nuclear war, about the missiles, likely saving billions of lives. Story 6. Weirs are drowning machines. Those tiny dams you see on rivers are shaped like this, kinda, under the water, and this shape causes a circular flow of water. As the water circulates, it gets aerated, lowering the density. So if you swim in one, not only are you trapped on the longest spin cycle, but you can't get out because the water isn't dense enough to swim in. Apparently, they recommend that if you're caught in one, to try and escape, you should tuck your chin and curl into the fetal position with your arms wrapped around yourself to try and be caught by the current and pushed along the riverbed past the hydraulics of the boil line. Story 7. When the German battleship Bismarck went down after hours of constant battering, 1,500 of the 2,000-men crew were able to jump into the ocean. The Royal Navy rescued 500 of them, but left early due to a lack of fuel and the threat of submarines. Over 1,000 men were left on the ocean to die, having just survived pure hell. Today, the area of the wreck is littered with thousands of leather boots, having once belonged to the crew which died because they were abandoned. The average age of the crew was a little over 20 years. Story 8. The crew of Challenger likely survived over a minute after the initial explosion. They were killed by the impact on the water. There is evidence that members of the crew even started trying to complete emergency procedures. The report from the New York Times about how the bodies were found is also disturbing. The compartment was little more than a pile of rubble on the ocean floor, 8 feet high and 50 feet across. They said the astronauts' remains were crushed inside the debris and could not be recognized as human. Federal investigators studying the wreckage believe the crew compartment fell intact nearly 9 miles to the surface of the sea where it shattered on impact. Story 9. In 1972, a plane crashed in the Andes on a snowy mountain. 16 of the 45 people, mostly guys of a rugby team from Uruguay, survived there for 72 days. They had to eat the human flesh of the people who died during or after the crash in order to survive. No one knew where the plane crashed exactly, and they were only found because two of the guys walked for 10 days over the mountains and down into a valley where a farmer found them. Story 10. I've talked about this before. Motorcycle helmets are ridiculously unsafe if you live in America. The Department of Transportation, DOT standard is so low that bicycle helmets have passed it. QRD of this great video on it. Face shields are untested. A loose pebble could shatter it and it would still pass DOT. Companies can choose their testers. They can and do choose the most lenient standards based on car accidents, not motorcycle crashes. Failure is 400 gravitational acceleration of impact. 290 g is what cracks your skull open. Chin bars were not tested. Roll-off is not tested. 20% of DOT-approved helmets, when retested, did not pass. Minimal tests are announced, which is standard, but manufacturers can and do make helmets stronger in test areas, but nowhere else. Story 11. The police once helped Jeffrey Dahmer kill someone. Dahmer had performed a homemade lobotomy on 14-year-old Konorak Sintha Somphone. Dahmer had left the boy alone while he went out, and miraculously Sintha Somphone managed to escape his apartment despite being cognitively impaired from the lobotomy. He worked his way out to the street where a group of women discovered him. Being rightfully concerned for the boy, they called the police for assistance. The police arrive and mistake the boy for being drunk. The group of women grew frustrated as it was clear the cops weren't taking the situation seriously. During this time, Jeffrey Dahmer made his way back home and discovered the unfolding situation. Dahmer was quickly able to manipulate the situation in his favor. He convinced the cops that the Konorak Sintha Somphone was his young boyfriend and that he was just drunk. The cops believed him, much to the dismay of the group of women, and returned the poor boy to Jeffrey Dahmer, sealing his fate. Story 12. The BGP routing table controls the entire internet. It's a 520 kilobits per second file, and it is how edge routers talk to one another. It's not regulated in the least. It's completely controlled by whatever company is pushing out the update that hour. Facebook's last major outage happened because internal BGP routing tables propagated the wrong routes. Japan lost all its internet service in 2017 during what is called the Japan BGP event, August 25, 2017. No one likes to discuss it because of how easy the exploit is. I won't put it here, but it's very, very simple. All it would take is 2 or 3 very disgruntled network operators in 3 ISPs or more to just push a bad table out and the internet would be down for days or weeks. Story 13. In the early 2000s, a startup perfected the algae-to-oil process where raw sewage was fed to genetically modified algae. The algae would consume CO2 and sewage and would purify the liquid to a point where it could be filtered and used as drinking water, all while photosynthesizing and releasing O2. After several months, the algae would be farmed and oil would be extracted. Exxon bought the company. Story 14. The U.S. government was exposed for illegally spying on its citizens through their webcams in 2013, and no one even really gave a shit or did anything about it. They mostly just called the dude who did it, Edward Snowden, a traitor, so it's still probably happening. There was a school in a suburb just outside of Philly that gave their students laptops to take home. Turned out that a parent discovered the school, actually it was the principal, could spy on the kids through the webcam. Where do most kids keep their laptops? In bedrooms. The principal was able to watch these young kids in states of undress. The lawsuit resulted in a $600,000 settlement, with the lawyers receiving $400,000 of that amount. Lower Merion is a suburb. Story 15. There's a form of animal that burrows into your ankle and leaves its larvae there. The only way to remove the larvae is to pull on the thin, white, worm-like thing dangling out of your ankle by wrapping it around a pencil and slowly unwinding it. The only problem is if it snaps, it spreads everywhere and kills you through malnutrition. Story 16. Orcas show more cruelty towards other animals than any other species except for humans. They will torture seals for hours on end, eventually drowning them, biting off their heads, and then throwing them at each other as a sort of volleyball game. They'll also knock seals off of the chunk of ice they're resting on using waves created by their tails. They'll then wait for it to get back onto the ice shelf, then do it again. This has happened for hours before they drown it and do the text above to it. They will also smack fish up to 100 feet in the air, breaking every bone in its body for fun. We believe it's for fun because they don't touch it afterward, not a single bite of food whatsoever. There's also at least one documented case of an orca murdering a moose that was traveling between islands. Humans are the one exception, excluding captive ones that always end up having mental problems for obvious reasons, that orcas never seem to have extreme cruelty towards for seemingly no reason. I think it's because they see themselves in us as we are also monsters. Also, there are cases where if a shark sees a single orca, it will not return to that area for at least 1 year. Story 17. DuPont manufactured and dumped toxic chemicals in the water in unknown quantities for decades. PFAs bioaccumulate in your system and cause cancer, among other deadly maladies. They are currently researching a correlation between vaccine ineffectiveness and PFAs. What's the disturbing part? Well, dear Redditors, you already have PFA contamination in your very own blood, unsolicitedly given to you by DuPont. Reference: my dad was the lead scientist whistleblower over a decade ago. He was interviewed by John Oliver. It's finally just now getting the traction it needs to be banned by lawmakers, but it's already everywhere. Story 18. When Norway almost caused our end. At the Russian radar station, the crew saw a missile suddenly separate into several sections, just as the warheads of a Trident missile would. Their trajectory seemed to be carrying them towards Moscow. In Moscow, a signal went out to the nuclear briefcases that always accompany President Boris Yeltsin and top defense officials. Russia had established a deadline. They're supposed to detect an attack, assess it, and reach a decision on retaliation within 10 minutes. There were only 5 minutes left. Urgent radio contact was made with Russian submarine commanders. Orders were given to go into a state of combat readiness, and the military issued orders to the strategic forces to prepare to possibly receive the next command, which would have been the launch order. For 4 minutes, the Russian commanders waited for the order to launch. The Russian strategic plans permit launching Russian missiles before enemy missiles hit Russian territory. 8 minutes after the alarm was first sounded, the mysterious objects fell into the seas. The decision to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike was averted. The Russian forces stood down. Hours later, the Russians learned that the unidentified object had been a scientific rocket launched from Norway to study the northern lights. The Russian government had been notified weeks earlier the launch was coming, but no one told the radar crew. Story 19. Milgram experiment. I find it very disturbing that people can be forced into harming other people very easily when just following orders and having another person take all responsibility for all consequences from them. Milgram was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Stanley Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced into committing atrocities. For example, Germans in World War II. Story 20. In 2019, there was a website in the US that told you who your cable provider is based on your address. This was possible because the competing telecom companies have mutual agreements to make sure that they don't enter each other's areas. You used to be able to type in an address and check a whole list of them, but now the website directs you to call a phone number so that you can't check multiple addresses. It also prevents you from guessing who provides the cable to your neighbor. Methane is 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas, and yet when an oil well is drained, it is left to vent the methane into the atmosphere. It is literally worse for the environment to release methane than it is to burn it. There is no hope of terraforming Mars. If the Martian atmosphere were replaced with an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, the lack of greenhouse gases would cause the temperature to drop below the current average of 62 C. We're better off moving to Antarctica if it is still above sea level. During the Cold War, both the USA and the USSR lost nuclear weapons, and many of them still haven't been found by their respective countries. Have they been found by others and not reported? We don't know. Somebody someday will be the last human to die. Story 21. During World War II, the Japanese guards overseeing the construction of the Burma Railway, using Allied POWs from Changi prison camp, would stand Allied prisoners up in swamps tied to stakes. Their mates were sent out to collect materials and complete tasks, while the swamp would rise with the tropical rain. If the POWs on task did not return in time, their mates would drown. This is just one of the many sadistic tortures my grandfather endured during his 5 years in Changi and on the Burma Railway. Story 22. 3. Sailors were trapped in the hull of the USS West Virginia after the Pearl Harbor attacks for 16 days. The Marines standing guard couldn't do anything to help them and heard them banging to alert whoever could hear them that they were alive. Eventually, their bodies were retrieved 6 months later. They even kept a calendar marking their time stuck down there. Story 23. The case of toddler Wang Yue provided a chilling example of this that sparked sheer outrage. She had wandered from home and was infamously run over twice in a Chinese street and ignored by at least 18 citizens who continued to walk past as if nothing happened, before somebody finally stopped to help. The entire event was caught by a surveillance camera, and for those of you who end up looking it up, be warned, it is extremely graphic. Story 24, that in the late 90s there was this guy in Japan named Hisashi Uchi who was blasted with the highest dose of radiation in history. He melted away for 83 days, having completely shattered DNA. He probably died one of the worst deaths there could be. I've seen the pictures of what he looked like when he was in the hospital, and it's terrifying. He looked like a Slim Jim covered in blood and pus. Story 25. There may have been tons of civilizations coexisting in the universe. It is also possible that in the time the universe has existed, a majority of these civilizations will have gone extinct, lost to time and space, intelligent life that will never be found or ever known about by any other civilizations in the universe. Entropy and decay would eventually erase all evidence. What's even more disturbing is that we aren't even close to being a Type 1 civilization, and already we are facing issues like global warming and rising sea levels. We will likely go extinct before ever reaching a Type 1 civilization. We will be lost to time, never being discovered and never answering the ultimate question if we are alone or not. Story 26. 1. The United States uses a sanitized version of the unemployment rate to make it seem like more people have jobs than they do. They exclude anyone unemployed for reasons other than looking for a new job, needed to leave work to care for a loved one, got a long-term illness, or started a side hustle. You are not counted among the unemployed. This was a deliberate change to how it used to be counted. 2. The U.S. military has a media office that works directly with Hollywood. If you want to use military equipment or sets for filming, you have to submit the script to them for approval. You guessed it. You have to make the military sound good or they won't help you. Even better, the notes for script changes are available to the public. They really don't like war crimes to be brought up at all, even hypothetically. Story 27. A French corporal in World War I kept a journal in which he recorded his time in the trenches. In one extract that had been written after a battle, he wrote that it began to rain and the trenches became muddy and flooded. Whilst he was helping to clear up the mud and water, bodies began to flow in from no man's land and seep into the trench. The bodies were decaying from days of festering, but the worst part was he had been friends with one of the bodies that had come in. Story 28. In Chicago, currently, only 0.2% of non-fatal shootings result in an arrest. This is down from the 5%, 10% arrest rate for fatal shootings between 2010 to 2015. The police have simply given up. Unless you can name your shooter, tell the police where to find them, promise to testify and harass the police until they make an arrest, they won't even try. An example of the effort level in the city to address crime. My sister called 911 around midnight after there was a large eruption of gunfire outside her Chicago apartment, in a relatively good neighborhood no less. The 911 dispatcher told her to go check if anyone died or needed an ambulance. Otherwise, they wouldn't even send a squad car to drive down the street and investigate. Story 29. Cotard's syndrome, also known as walking corpse syndrome, is a psychological disorder in which the person believes they are dead, rotting, or missing limbs. They will stop eating, drinking, bathing, and everything because they believe they are no longer alive. Capgras syndrome is a disorder in which a person believes that someone close to them has been replaced by an imposter. It could be their parent, spouse, or even pet. In a sort of opposition to Capgras syndrome is Fregoli delusion. With this disorder, a person believes that multiple people in their lives are being played by a single person. Body identity integrity disorder is a disorder in which the person has an intense wish to amputate a limb. The person believes that the limb is not part of their body. Alien hand syndrome is a disorder in which one hand seems to develop a mind of its own. It will begin to move and perform certain actions without the person consciously knowing it is happening. Story 30. Some tumors called teratomas can grow hair and teeth. along with some other stuff, but I find these the most terrifying. A teratoma is a rare type of tumor that can contain fully developed tissues and organs, including hair, teeth, muscle, and bone. Teratomas are most common in the tailbone, ovaries, and testicles, but can occur elsewhere in the body. One theory of teratomas suggests that the condition originates in these primordial germ cells. This is called the parthenogenetic theory and is now the prevailing view. It explains how teratomas can be found with hair, wax, and teeth, and can even appear as an almost formed fetus. The location of teratomas also argues for their origin in primitive germ cells. In about 1 in 500,000 people, a very rare type of teratoma can appear, called fetus in fetu, fetus within a fetus. This teratoma can have the appearance of a malformed fetus. It's made up of living tissue, but without the support of a placenta and an amniotic sac, the undeveloped fetus has no chance of development. One theory explains the fetus in fetu teratoma as the remains of a twin that was unable to develop in the womb and was encompassed by the body of the surviving child. Story 31. There is a finite possibility that everything could end for us instantly. Due to the nature of the universe, we may be currently in a stable, but not the most stable possible state. The false vacuum decay, high vacuum instability, or any of several variations implies that the universe could switch to its more stable state. We would see nothing coming since it would travel at the speed of light. Scenarios differ as to whether anything that we recognize could continue. Although it is possible that galaxies, stars, and even possibly biological life could survive, the other extreme is that even normal matter would not survive. Likelihood? Who knows? Story 32. At any particular moment, due to quantum fluctuations, some very small part of the universe might suffer a false vacuum decay. If this happens, an unstoppable spherical bubble of annihilation will expand outward at the speed of light. The rest of the universe will have no idea anything is happening because the bubble itself is expanding at the speed of light. You wouldn't know it was coming until it got to you, but you wouldn't know anything about it after either. Outside the bubble is the regular old universe with no sign of anything wrong. Inside the bubble is a different kind of physics, simpler physics, probably incapable of supporting any kind of complex chemistry, much less life. Not even the atoms will survive. Not only will the universe cease to exist, but it will cease to exist in any meaningful way. Story 33. Mongols used to believe that bathing would anger the dragons who took control of water bodies, because this meant that they would see filthy water and get mad, so they almost never bathed, never washed their clothes either, not even washing dishes, just ew, but were tolerant of all religions and had a better legal system than many countries today. For example, if a man was caught cheating on his wife, his lips would be cut and the Silk Road that they created was more safer than today's London. It is said that a man carries a plate full of gold on his head and walks all the way and does not worry about a thing. No good would ever be stolen. Story 34. The Carrington event was the most intense geomagnetic storm in recorded history, occurring on 1 September 1859 during solar cycle 10. It created strong auroral displays that were reported globally and caused sparking and fire in multiple telegraph systems. The geomagnetic storm was most likely the result of a coronal mass ejection, CME, from the Sun colliding with Earth's magnetosphere. Story 35. There is a type of bird that is popular in New Zealand and Australia called a kiwi. The kiwi bird measures to not even a foot. This fact will come in handy in a minute. The kiwi is also known to be related to ostriches, emus, and cassowaries. Those birds measure to be several feet tall and lay 6 to 7 inch eggs. Well, the kiwi, which isn't even a foot tall, lays 6-7 inch eggs as well and is also flightless. So when a kiwi manages to lay the egg actually rearranges the organs of the kiwi. Story 36. The warlord Johnny Beg went on jihad against the Genoese community of Kaffa in Crimea at the western end of the Silk Road. Johnny Beg besieged the town and catapulted plague-ridden corpses into the city. The resulting maritime refugee crisis brought the plague to Constantinople, Crete, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, before the plague reached the southern tip of Italy and also reached Marseille around the same time, as that would have been quite near the closest port the Genoese could get to Genoa by sea. From there, the plague spread over almost all of the European continent and even as far as Iceland. Waves of plague came and went for decades, It was so bad that estimates between 1/3 and 2/3 of the entire population of Europe died during the Black Death. It might never have happened if not for Johnny Begg's Holy War. Story 37. Did you know that the Naegleria fowleri is a brain-eating virus that enters through the nose? Symptoms won't show until about a week later. Did you know fir trees can grow in human lungs? Don't ask how I won't know. Did you know giant Japanese hornets are attracted to human sweat? Yeah, it's no big deal. Don't sweat it. Horned toads can squirt blood out of their eyes. Story 38. Our meat supply is extremely loaded with antibiotics and the USDA knows it. Meat packers heavily inject sick cattle just so they're able to be processed because they need to be able to stand. I worked at USDA during college and was shocked they do nothing when the petri dish won't grow bacteria because the meat, kidney, or injection site juice is so potent. Story 39. The universe was created on a defect while smashing matter and antimatter together. Somehow more matter came out of the reaction of energy smashing into itself, making it so there was too little antimatter for the normal matter to collide with, making energy, meaning that the whole universe was based off a natural defect. Story 40. Before slavery was abolished, a lot of plantation owners would have had slave auctions where they sold men and women off for breeding purposes. They would also hold a real-life Hunger Game where they'd hunt the slaves with shooting rifles and the last one standing was a free man. Slave owners would also often use black babies as alligator bait and would also use slaves as pieces of clothing and furniture, and when the time for them came to need new teeth dentures, they just ripped them from the slaves' mouths and used them instead. During this time as well, slaves were also held in zoos for viewing. Story 41. Hospitals regularly give old people legal doses of morphine to help with pain as they near death. This will itself often lead to the patient's death as morphine causes extreme dry throat and tightening of the larynx. This can cause many patients to either suffocate or have heart attacks. It has often been suspected that hospitals deliberately give morphine to particularly high-maintenance old people to expedite their exit. It has always interested me that this final trial by medicine is used to decide the short-term fate of a patient. Story 42. Everything can seemingly suddenly cease to exist at any moment. If we're in a simulation, it can all be erased. If there is a God, he can erase it all. Or maybe you're the first victim of a shooting and you're dead before you even realize what was happening, and everything from our perspective just ends and the universe keeps going. Basically, at any moment, everything can suddenly end without you ever knowing how or to what extent.